Before we open the steel door, a necessary warning. This examination is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It is not financial, legal, or medical advice, and it is not a recommendation to buy, sell, short, or hold Humacyte or any other security. This report is based on public SEC filings, FDA materials, peer-reviewed research, court records, company announcements, patent documents, market records, and index reconstitution materials reviewed through July 30, 2026. Clinical results discussed in this episode were reported by Humacyte or published by investigators. Lawsuit allegations remain unproven. Insider sales, family relationships, financings, index removals, and declining share prices do not independently establish fraud or illegal conduct. Do your own investigation before entering the crime scene. Gallery, bring the body in. Tonight's patient is Humacyte. Ticker, HUMA. The company develops bioengineered human tissues designed to be stored off the shelf, implanted when needed, and gradually repopulated by the recipient's own cells. Its first approved product is Symvess, and before we begin counting the blood bags, the terminology needs cleaning. Symvess is sometimes described casually as a lab-grown cellular vein that is close enough for a hallway conversation. It is not technically precise. Humacyte manufactures the vessel using human vascular cells. Those original cells are then removed during production. What remains is an extracellular matrix shaped like a blood vessel and a cellular tissue-engineered vessel. It arrives without living donor cells, does not require tissue matching or immunosuppression, and is designed to become repopulated by the patient's own cells after implantation. The patient does not receive somebody else's living vein. They receive the architecture. The original tenants have already vacated. On December 19, 2024, the FDA approved Symvess for adults as a vascular conduit in extremity arterial injuries when urgent restoration of blood flow is needed to avoid imminent limb loss and the patient's own vein is not feasible. The FDA described it as the first approved acellular tissue-engineered vessel. That distinction matters. This is not an empty laboratory with a ticker symbol taped to a freezer. Humacyte brought an unusual regenerative medicine platform through manufacturing, clinical trials, regulatory review, and full FDA approval. The patient has a pulse, and the pulse deserves an examination before we begin the financial autopsy. The strongest argument for Symvess begins with the trauma evidence. A peer-reviewed analysis published in JAMA Surgery examined an analytic subset of 67 extremity trauma patients from 2 studies. 51 came from a prospective civilian trauma study. 16 came from treatment in frontline Ukrainian hospitals. These were seriously injured patients for whom the treating surgeon determined that an adequate autologous vein was unavailable. Many also faced elevated infection risk. At 30 days, the combined Symvess group had an observed conduit infection rate of 0.9%. The literature-derived benchmark for synthetic grafts was 8.4%. The observed amputation rate was 4.5%. The synthetic graft benchmark was 24.3%. Secondary patency was 91.5%, compared with a historical benchmark of 78.9%. Those are large observed differences, and several of the confidence intervals separated from the historical benchmarks. But they did not come from a randomized head-to-head trial. The Humacyte studies were single-arm and non-randomized. The synthetic graft comparisons came from previously published medical literature. Different studies can contain different patient populations, injury severity, surgical practices, follow-up procedures, and definitions. The authors themselves cautioned that historical benchmarks require careful interpretation. The evidence supports the conclusion that Symvess produced encouraging infection, patency, and limb salvage outcomes in a difficult patient population. It does not support pretending that a randomized synthetic graft superiority trial occurred when it did not. The numbers are interesting enough without embalming the limitations. There is also an important safety counterweight. The FDA-approved prescribing information contains a boxed warning for graft failure. Loss of Symvess integrity from a mid-graft rupture or failure at the surgical connection can cause life-threatening hemorrhage. The label also identifies thrombosis and other serious risks. That does not make the product illegitimate. Serious medical products often carry serious warnings because they are used in serious circumstances. But any investment presentation displaying the infection and amputation comparisons should also display the boxed warning and study limitations. A clean autopsy includes both sides of the incision. Humacyte possesses a genuine first-mover position. Few companies have reached the same combination of human cell-based manufacturing, removal of the original cells, off-the-shelf storage, implantation without immunosuppression, and United States approval. But saying Humacyte has no competition would be false. The company already competes against established clinical options, the patient's own vein, synthetic grafts, biological grafts,
and depending on the indication, AV fistulas and other vascular access products.
It also faces emerging regenerative technologies. Zeltis has begun an early European commercial launch of its Access vascular access conduit and is conducting a United States pivotal trial. Zeltis reported its first European commercial implantation and said enrollment in its United States pivotal study had exceeded 50%. Its technology is different. Access uses a polymer-based, bioabsorbable scaffold intended to transform into living tissue after implantation. Humacyte grows its matrix using human cells and then removes those cells. But the two companies could eventually compete for some of the same dialysis access patients. Humacyte is not standing alone in an empty cemetery. It may, however, be the first company to move this particular kind of vessel through the United States regulatory door. Humacyte's intellectual property cabinet also reaches beyond vascular conduits. Humacyte says its controlled and licensed tubular prostheses patent portfolio includes granted claims involving engineered tracheal, esophageal, and urinary conduit structures. The company holds a mixture of owned, jointly owned, and exclusively licensed patent rights, including rights connected with Yale University. The urinary conduit technology describes structures intended for urinary diversion and potential replacement of portions of the urinary tract. The esophageal intellectual property covers structural characteristics, mechanical properties, and manufacturing methods. Humacyte has also discussed longer-term applications involving the trachea, cell delivery systems, and a bioengineered vascular pancreas. This is meaningful platform breadth. It is also early. The company says these constructs have been evaluated in early preclinical models, with further optimization and larger animal studies still planned. These are not approved products. They are not late-stage human clinical programs. A granted patent means legal claims were obtained over an invention. It does not prove that the invention works safely in humans. It does not provide FDA approval. It does not produce reimbursement, and it does not appear as revenue on the income statement. The organs exist in the intellectual property cabinet. Most have not yet reached the operating room. Now we move from the scientific ward into the financial basement. Because while Humacyte was growing vessels, it was also growing the share count. In February 2024, Humacyte sold approximately 15.4 million shares at $3 each. Net proceeds were approximately $43 million. In September 2024, it established a Lincoln Park equity line allowing the company, subject to the agreement's terms, to sell as much as $50 million of additional stock. In October, Humacyte sold approximately 5.68 million shares accompanied by matching warrants. The combined purchase price was $5.28. Net proceeds were approximately $28 million. In November, it sold another 2.81 million shares with matching warrants at a combined price of $5.34. Net proceeds were approximately $14.9 million. The financings were not identical. They were not all connected with fresh clinical announcements. But the cadence was quick. By the end of the year, the capital structure had a recurring appointment at the blood bank. Then came the breakthrough shareholders had been waiting for. FDA approval arrived in December 2024. After completion of the required commercial batch review, Humacyte announced the commercial launch in February 2025. The product could finally leave the facility without being chased down the hallway by regulatory security. Then, on March 25, 2025, approximately 1 month after commercial shipments were authorized, Humacyte priced another public offering. 25 million shares, $2 each, approximately $46.7 million net. Commercial launches are expensive. Manufacturing, inventory, quality control, surgeon education, hospital approval committees, reimbursement support, specialized sales personnel, and continuing clinical trials all consume cash. The timing does not establish wrongdoing or an improper purpose behind the financing, but the financial diagnosis was becoming clear. FDA approval had not made Humacyte self-funding. The company still required a large outside transfusion. Now moved to October 2025. On October 6th, Humacyte announced published long-term results involving 17 Ukrainian patients treated with Symvess for extremity vascular injuries. The company reported 87.1% patency, 100% limb salvage, and no conduit infections in that small retrospective group, with follow-up reaching as long as 18 months. The sample was limited, but the reported results were encouraging. Real patients, real wartime injuries, real evidence that the vessel could function under conditions that do not normally appear in a cheerful investor presentation. Humacyte entered a securities purchase agreement on October 6th and announced the financing publicly on October 7th. The transaction sold approximately 28.44 million shares. It also issued warrants for another 28.44 million shares. The combined purchase price was $2.11. Gross proceeds were approximately $60 million. Net proceeds were approximately $56.5 million. Good clinical news entered through the front entrance. The financing paperwork was already checking its coat. Timing alone does not establish wrongdoing or an improper purpose behind the financing. Biotechnology companies frequently raise money after favorable data because positive evidence improves access to capital. But existing shareholders received encouraging clinical information and a large share and warrant package almost together. Those warrants remained a potential additional block of approximately 28.44 million shares as of March 31st, 2026. The science may have been regenerating tissue. The capital structure was discovering mitosis. Humacyte's exit from the Oberland revenue interest arrangement required more than one visit to the payment window. In September 2025, the company made a $50 million partial call payment. Then, in December, it completed the termination by paying approximately another $38 million in cash, covering certain legal fees, and issuing roughly 5.73 million shares. The December cash payment was funded primarily with the initial $40 million draw under a New Avenue Capital term loan facility. Across the two Oberland steps, approximately $88 million in cash left the building before counting the share consideration. One financing arrangement was removed. Another lender entered the room carrying fresh paperwork. The old financing did not leave quietly. It took cash. It took shares, and it requested one final ride in the hearse. During the first quarter of 2026, Humacyte sold approximately 4.02 million shares through an at-the-market facility. Net proceeds were about $4.6 million. March produced a different kind of specimen. On March 19th, the prospectus supplement for Humacyte's registered direct offering disclosed that the company had received a binding minimum purchase commitment on March 4th. The commitment covered approximately $1,475,000 of Symvess intended to support surgeon education and hospital clinical evaluation in Saudi Arabia. Humacyte was also negotiating a possible Saudi joint venture and commercial license. The commitment was real. The proposed joint venture and commercial license terms remained unfinished, and the filing did not describe a completed Saudi commercial authorization. But this was not a separate bullish press release followed by financing. The commercial development was disclosed inside the offering prospectus itself. That offering sold 25 million shares at 80 cents, $20 million gross, approximately $18.3 million net. Humacyte later highlighted the Saudi commitment in its first quarter business update and issued a standalone announcement in July. So this specimen belongs in both files: genuine international commercial development and continuing dependence on outside capital. It is not as clean a catalyst to financing sequence as October 2025 or June 2026. A fair coroner does not force the evidence to confess to a timeline it did not commit. That lower offering price also reset the Avenue Capital warrant exercise price to 80 cents and reduced the related loan conversion price to $1.04. The conversion price equaled 130% of the reset warrant price. The discount did not remain on one examination table. It reached the instruments next door. Internationally, Humacyte also filed a marketing authorization application for Symvess in Israel. In April, the Israeli Ministry of Health accepted the application for review and established a stated 180 working day review period. Acceptance is not approval. It does not guarantee a positive decision or immediate sales, but it shows that the company's commercial plan extends beyond one trauma indication and one national market. Then came June 10, 2026. Humacyte announced company-reported positive interim results from the V012 Phase 3 Dialysis Access Study. The pre-specified analysis included the first 80 female patients who completed 12 months of follow-up. Patients receiving Humacyte's ATEV averaged 220 catheter-free days. Patients receiving the standard autologous AV fistula averaged 129, a difference of 91 days, approximately 3 additional months without relying on an indwelling catheter. Humacyte reported that the study met its primary endpoint with a p-value of 0.00070. It also reported access-related infection rates of 6 per 100 patient years for the ATEV group, compared with 23 for the fistula group. No spontaneous ruptures were reported in either group. The company said it planned to submit a supplemental biologics license application during the second half of 2026 for adults with end-stage kidney disease who face an increased risk that a conventional AV fistula will fail to mature. This was legitimately important clinical news. The ATEV is not approved for dialysis, but the interim result created a credible regulatory path toward a much larger indication. On that same calendar date, Humacyte entered an underwriting agreement to sell 47,619,048 shares at $1.05 each. Expected net proceeds were approximately $46.8 million. The underwriters also received a 30-day option to purchase as many as another 7,142,857 shares. The clinical result and financing occupied the same date. Timing alone does not establish wrongdoing or an improper purpose behind the financing. Humacyte needed money for commercialization, manufacturing, the dialysis filing, clinical development, and general operations. But the sequence illustrates the shareholder dilemma. A successful clinical result can increase the company's future value. It can also immediately create an opportunity to sell a much larger number of shares. The pulse strengthened. The financing team brought a larger needle. Now examine the capital DNA. Humacyte had approximately 130 million shares outstanding at the end of 2024. It had approximately 193 million at the end of 2025. By May 11, 2026, the company reported approximately 222.02 million shares outstanding. After the base June offering, a beneficial ownership filing calculated 269,638,156 shares outstanding as of June 12th. That figure does not necessarily include every subsequent employee issuance, warrant exercise, or any exercise of the underwriter's additional share option. Outstanding shares are also not identical to public float. The float excludes certain restricted and closely held positions, but the issued share count has expanded rapidly. The financing department has not merely been growing blood vessels, it has been growing denominators. On June 9th, shareholders approved an increase in authorized common stock from 350 million shares to 550 million. The amendment became effective that day. The underwritten offering followed on June 10th. Authorized shares are not outstanding dilution, they are capacity. They can support equity compensation, warrant exercises, acquisitions, strategic transactions, financings, and other lawful corporate purposes. The sequence expanded Humacyte's available equity capacity and immediately used part of that capacity. Timing alone does not establish that the full 200 million share authorization increase was intended for that single offering. but the additional room matters. The supply cabinet is substantially larger than it was before the vote. Now examine the financial blood panel. At March 31st, 2026, Humacyte reported $48.5 million in cash and cash equivalents. It used approximately $25.1 million in operating activities during the first quarter. Its accumulated deficit stood at approximately $744.5 million. Management stated that without sufficient commercial cash flow or additional capital, the company would not have enough liquidity to operate beyond 1 year from issuance of the financial statements. The filing said those conditions raised substantial doubt about Humacyte's ability to continue as a going concern. That is not Inspector Wick adding thunder. That is management's own financial pathology language. The June offering materially extended the runway. Humacyte also reduced its workforce by approximately 45 employees, deferred planned hiring, and reduced other operating expenses. The company estimated approximately $14.3 million of net savings during the remainder of 2026 after related costs. A reliable current runway calculation still requires the next quarterly filing. We need updated cash, updated operating burn, debt activity, working capital, manufacturing expenses, and actual commercial collections. The accurate diagnosis is not cashless tomorrow. It is continuing dependence on outside capital while management attempts to lower burn and increase commercial revenue. Humacyte did not enter the commercial launch carrying only a brochure and a prayer. Before launch, the company reported hiring and training 10 specialized sales representatives. According to Humacyte, their average medical device and biotechnology experience exceeded 15 years. The company said all 10 had vascular surgery or trauma experience and were multi-year President's Club performers in prior sales organizations. Those are company-provided credentials. They are not independent proof that the launch will succeed. But they show that management attempted to build a specialized sales organization rather than assigning the product to an intern with a LinkedIn password. In April 2026, Humacyte appointed Jim Mercadante as Chief Commercial Officer. The company said he brought more than 25 years of healthcare and medical technology experience and would oversee sales, marketing, and market access. In July, Humacyte added nephrologists Robert Kosman and Prabir Roy Chaudhary as advisors preparing for a possible dialysis launch. Their anticipated work includes reimbursement, market access, medical education, scientific engagement, and launch strategy. That is a credible collection of relevant experience. It is still a team waiting for a scoreboard. Commercial revenue remains early. Humacyte reported approximately $493,000 in product revenue during the first quarter of 2026, compared with approximately $147,000 in the first quarter of 2025. Cost of goods sold was approximately $2.04 million, but that figure included an approximately $1.6 million inventory reserve, excess manufacturing capacity, and royalties. It would be misleading to divide those figures and declare that every vessel permanently costs 4 times its selling price. Early launch economics were affected by low volume, the inventory reserve, excess manufacturing capacity, and royalties. The defensible conclusion is that Symvess had not reached commercial scale by quarter end. The company has reported expanding hospital eligibility, federal contracting access, and early purchases. But eligibility is not revenue. A first order is not a repeat customer. A newly appointed commercial officer is not a completed ramp, and a strong resume does not appear as cash on the balance sheet. The vital signs to monitor are units sold, repeat ordering, average revenue per unit, hospital approval timelines, reimbursement, inventory reserves, production utilization, and gross margin improvement. The slow launch does not automatically mean rejection. Symvess is a new product for an unpredictable emergency indication. Hospitals may require value analysis approval, surgeons must be trained and become comfortable using it. Inventory may remain unused until the correct trauma patient arrives. A newly approved surgical product can take time to enter established treatment routines, but novelty is not a complete explanation until sales prove it. The morgue accepts patients. It does not accept blank revenue lines forever. Now we enter the family room. Brady W. Dugan is the husband of Humacyte founder, president, and chief executive officer Laura Nicklason. Dugan is also a Humacyte director. He previously served as Chief Executive Officer of Credit Suisse from 2007 through 2015, and later became Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Exos Securities. Humacyte's proxy identifies his experience financing public and private companies as part of his qualification to serve on the board. The man seated near the company's capital structure has spent much of his career around capital. Humacyte classifies both Nicholson and Dugan as non-independent directors. That is governance context. It is not an accusation. The board has a separate chair, and Humacyte says its audit, compensation, and nominating and governance committees consist of independent directors. The chief executive and her husband occupy seats at the same examination table. The independent committees are the orderlies assigned to watch the instruments. Dugan also controls Iabudge LLC, an entity that historically held a substantial Humacyte position. SEC filings show that millions of Humacyte shares were pledged in connection with financing arrangements. Iabudge sold shares on multiple occasions. The filings repeatedly stated that Dugan used the proceeds to pay down leverage. They also clarified that shares directly owned by Nicholson were not the shares sold in the cited transactions. The verified wording is leverage, not bankruptcy, not insolvency, not proof that Dugan knew Humacyte would fail. The toe tag reads, pledged shares, repeated sales, and a filing stated purpose of reducing leverage. Anything stronger lacks evidentiary support. Now to the courthouse. The primary federal securities class action is Cutshall versus Humacyte. Plaintiffs alleged misleading statements or omissions involving product safety, Humacyte's manufacturing facility, and company liquidity. On March 31, 2026, the federal court granted the defendant's motion to dismiss in part and denied it in part. Claims based on alleged facility fraud and liquidity fraud were dismissed without prejudice. The court found that the plaintiffs had not sufficiently connected the FDA approval delay with alleged facility deficiencies. It also concluded that raising capital before a company completely exhausts its cash does not, by itself, establish that earlier liquidity projections were fraudulent. Those portions of the case were released from the examination room. But the court allowed claims based on alleged product safety fraud to continue, along with related control person claims. That is not a factual finding that Humacyte committed fraud. It is not a verdict. No damages have been awarded. At the motion to dismiss stage, the question is whether allegations are legally sufficient to continue, not whether the plaintiffs have proven them. One principal theory remains alive. On July 1st, the docket recorded an order appointing a mediator. That does not establish liability. It does not mean substantive mediation sessions have occurred. It does not indicate that settlement discussions have succeeded, and it does not predict how the case will end. The surviving portion of the case remains unresolved after the dismissal stage. Now return to dialysis. This remains the strongest organ in the long-term bull case. Dialysis access is a larger and more recurring clinical opportunity than emergency vascular trauma. AV fistulas can require weeks or months to mature. Some never become suitable for dialysis. During that period, patients may remain dependent on central venous catheters, carrying infection and complication risks. Humacyte's interim V012 result showed 91 additional catheter-free days in the prespecified female population and a lower company-reported access-related infection rate. The ATEV has also received FDA, Regenerative Medicine, Advanced Therapy, and Fast Track designations for dialysis access. Those designations can facilitate development and regulatory communication. They are not approval. Humacyte plans to submit a supplemental biologics license application during the second half of 2026. That is a credible regulatory plan. It is not an expected approval date. The application must be completed. The FDA must accept it for review. The agency must evaluate efficacy, safety, manufacturing, inspections, statistical analyses, and the proposed label. The study focused on female patients at increased risk of fistula maturation failure. That is an important population with an unmet need. But investors should not silently convert that result into an assumed label covering every dialysis patient. A planned filing is not approval. Approval is not reimbursement. Reimbursement is not adoption. Adoption is not automatically profitable manufacturing. The strongest bullish case is real. It is simply unfinished. Then the institutional orderlies arrived. During the June 2026 Russell reconstitution, HUMA was removed from the Russell 3000 and Russell Microcap indexes, effective after the market closed on June 26th. This was an index deletion. It was not a NASDAQ delisting. Humacyte continued trading on the exchange. Funds designed to track those benchmarks generally rebalance when a security is removed. That can create mechanical selling unrelated to the company's clinical prospects. The official deletion documents did not provide a Humacyte-specific reason. The exact number of shares sold by passive funds is not publicly separated. The defensible conclusion is limited. Humacyte lost membership in 2 Russell benchmarks, along with some benchmark-linked passive demand and institutional visibility. We cannot place every later red candle in Russell's body bag, but the passive orderlies did leave the room. One more institutional filing belongs in the evidence locker. On July 28th, BlackRock filed an amended Schedule 13G reporting beneficial ownership of approximately 4.09 million Humacyte shares. That represented approximately 1.5% of the outstanding common stock as of June 30th. The filing confirms that BlackRock's reported beneficial ownership was below the 5% reporting threshold. It does not explain why the position stood at that level. It does not separate the effects of share sales, Humacyte's expanded outstanding share count, index rebalancing, or ordinary activity across BlackRock-managed funds and accounts. This was not company dilution, and it is not evidence that BlackRock reached a verdict on the medical platform. It is a current institutional ownership update arriving shortly after Humacyte left the Russell ward. The filing tells us where the shares were reported. It does not tell us why the orderlies moved them. A separate potential overhang appeared in July. Fresenius Medical Care disclosed a Rule 10 B5-1 trading plan established on July 10th. The plan directed Citigroup to use reasonable best efforts to sell 5 million existing Humacyte shares after the required 30-day cooling-off period and through October 31st, subject to volume limits and other plan conditions. Fresenius said the decision was consistent with its reignite strategy. It also said the distribution agreement, as amended, remained in effect. This is not company dilution. Humacyte receives no proceeds. The shares already exist. But 5 million planned secondary shares can still create market supply, and the 5 million share plan may not be the end of the discharge paperwork. Fresenius stated that it expects to continue selling Humacyte shares after completion of the plan. The timing and amount of any additional sales will depend on Humacyte's business and financial position, the share price, market conditions, and other factors. In preparation for establishing the trading plan, Fresenius instructed its Humacyte board observer to stop attending board meetings and decline access to board materials and other confidential company information. It does not mean the amended distribution relationship has ended, but the potential secondary market overhang may extend beyond the initial 5 million shares. A strategic partner does not have to leave the building to place part of its position near the exit. Now correct the NASDAQ record. Humacyte received a minimum bid deficiency notice on May 4, 2026. On June 5th, NASDAQ informed the company that it had regained compliance and closed that matter. But the patient has returned to the edge of the listing ward. Public closing sale records show HUMA finishing below $1 for 30 consecutive market sessions from June 17th through July 30th. NASDAQ's formal test uses its official closing bid price, which is not necessarily identical to the closing sale price displayed on public charts. So public price history does not, by itself, prove that NASDAQ has officially determined a new deficiency. Through this report's cutoff, I found no publicly disclosed new notice. Companies generally have up to 4 business days after receiving a NASDAQ deficiency notification to announce it. So the absence of a filing tonight does not necessarily mean a letter has not been sent, or is not on the way. If NASDAQ's official closing bid record confirms the same 30-session sequence, a new deficiency notice would ordinarily begin another compliance process. It would not mean immediate suspension or delisting. No reverse split has been announced or scheduled, but reverse split risk is no longer remote. A future deficiency notice would generally provide an initial compliance period, assuming Humacyte remains eligible under NASDAQ's rules. Compliance ordinarily requires the closing bid price to remain at or above $1 for at least 10 consecutive business days, although NASDAQ may require a longer period. A large outstanding share count alone does not require a reverse split. A future board could consider one to address renewed listing risk, increase the nominal share price, reduce the outstanding count, or clear minimum price screens used by certain funds and brokerage policies. A higher quoted price might make the stock appear more conventional and could broaden the number of investors permitted to consider it. But a reverse split does not automatically attract institutions. It does not create enterprise value. It does not erase prior dilution. It does not stop cash burn. And it does not prevent the post-split price from declining. It puts the same body into a smaller bag. Because Humacyte now has 550 million authorized common shares, any future reverse split proposal would require careful reading. If outstanding shares were consolidated without a proportional reduction in authorized shares, the relative pool of authorized but unissued stock would increase substantially. That is a possible structural consequence. It is not evidence that management has selected that strategy. The ratio would matter. The treatment of authorized shares would matter. Warrant adjustments would matter. And the board's stated purpose would matter. Never let the undertaker move a decimal point without inspecting the paperwork. There is also a new coronary pulse. On July 27th, Humacyte announced that the FDA had accepted its investigational new drug application for a first-in-human Phase 2A study of a smaller coronary tissue-engineered vessel in coronary artery bypass grafting. The planned study is expected to enroll 10 patients. This is legitimate pipeline progress. It moves the coronary program from preclinical research toward human testing. It is not product approval. It is not human efficacy evidence. And it is not near-term commercial revenue. No human safety or efficacy results from the study had been reported through this episode's cutoff. But the program has entered the human study doorway. Through the July 30th review cutoff, Humacyte had not publicly announced an immediate equity offering alongside that development. The newest catalyst entered the room without an accompanying transfusion bag, at least through the cutoff. That distinction belongs in the file, too. A fair coroner records when the pattern does not repeat. So what is the final diagnosis? Humacyte is not a fabricated patient. It has genuine regenerative medicine technology. It has the first FDA-approved cellular tissue-engineered vessel. It has published trauma data showing encouraging infection, patency, and limb salvage outcomes, with important historical comparator limitations. It has a potentially larger dialysis indication supported by positive company-reported interim Phase 3 evidence. It has experienced commercial personnel. It has a broader controlled and licensed patent portfolio involving engineered tracheal, urinary, and esophageal structures. It has entered regulatory review in Israel. It has a developing commercial opportunity in Saudi Arabia. And it has moved a coronary bypass vessel toward first-in-human testing. The bullish thesis is not imaginary. The problem is not an absence of scientific or regulatory value. The problem is whether Humacyte can convert that value into sustainable commercial cash flow before continued financing transfers too much future value away from existing shareholders. The company also carries repeated equity issuance, large warrant packages, approximately 270 million shares outstanding after the base June offering. 550 million authorized common shares, going concern language, early commercial revenue, a partially surviving securities lawsuit for which the court has appointed a mediator, historical insider sales tied to disclosed leverage, loss of Russell Index membership, a 5 million share Fresenius selling plan with possible additional sales afterward, and a stock price that has returned to the edge of NASDAQ's minimum bid ward. NASDAQ compliance was restored in June. Public price history now strongly suggests renewed deficiency risk. Reverse split risk is unannounced, but it is no longer remote. Dialysis has a credible regulatory path, not guaranteed approval. The patents create future possibilities, not present revenue. The commercial team has relevant experience, not proven scale. and the Nobel Committee has not yet appeared in the SEC filings. Final diagnosis: a scientifically credible regenerative medicine platform with chronic capital dependence. Secondary findings: real science, real regulatory progress, a genuine first-mover advantage, promising trauma and dialysis evidence, early commercial revenue, a broader preclinical platform, repeated dilution, substantial financing capacity, potential secondary selling pressure, and a chart trained to inspect every cheerful press release for a second set of paperwork. Humacyte's scientific and regulatory accomplishments are real. Its financing dependence is also real. The unresolved question is whether commercial growth and expanded approvals can begin carrying the operation before additional financing transfers too much future value away from existing shareholders. The bull case lives. So does the risk. One is trying to regenerate the patient. The other keeps asking for another bag of blood. This examination is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It is not financial, legal, or medical advice, and it is not a recommendation to buy, sell, short, or hold Humacyte or any other security. Clinical results discussed here include company-reported data and evidence subject to regulatory review and scientific limitations. Lawsuit allegations remain unproven unless established through an adjudication on the merits. A settlement, if one occurs, would not necessarily include an admission or finding of liability. Insider sales, family relationships, financings, index changes, and declining share prices do not independently establish wrongdoing. Review the SEC filings. Read the FDA prescribing information. Examine the complete clinical evidence and its limitations. Consider the company's cash requirements, commercial execution, dilution capacity, regulatory uncertainty, listing risk, and your own tolerance for loss. Consult qualified professionals where appropriate. Do your own investigation before entering the crime scene. The vessel may regenerate. The share count remembers every transfusion. Like, subscribe, and stay alive out there. Oh, just one more thing. Before we close the drawer, there is another potential customer standing quietly at the end of the corridor. The United States military. Humacyte's relationship with military medicine did not begin after FDA approval. Department of Defense support for its vessel technology extends back more than a decade. Humacyte's latest annual filing identifies an approximately $6.8 million DoD grant supporting vascular reconstruction and repair. Older company filings describe additional defense awards, so that figure should not be treated as a complete accounting of every military-funded Humacyte program. In 2018, Humacyte's vascular trauma technology also received priority designation from the Secretary of Defense under Public Law 115-92. That law authorized the Defense Department to request FDA assistance in expediting the development and review of medical products considered important to military personnel. It did not lower the FDA's approval standard, but it confirms that military medicine was interested in this vessel long before it received a commercial label. The reason is not difficult to understand. In battlefield trauma, harvesting the patient's own vein consumes time, creates another surgical wound, and may not be possible when the patient's limbs or veins are already damaged. Synthetic grafts can also create additional infection concerns in contaminated wounds. Symvess is available off the shelf. Humacyte designed it as a universally implantable vessel that does not produce the immune rejection associated with cellular donor tissue. And the same vessel, later marketed as Symvess, was used in Ukraine to treat patients suffering gunshot and blast injuries during wartime. This is not a marketing department imagining a battlefield application. The battlefield arrived first. In 2024, the House Armed Services Committee directed the Secretary of Defense to brief Congress on the status of integrating biologic vascular repair into standard military trauma care. The requested briefing specifically included field testing and an assessment of potential long-term benefits. That was congressional oversight language, not a purchase order. Not an adoption mandate, but it placed biologic vascular repair inside the military evaluation process. Then, in July 2025, Symvess received approval for listing on the Defense Logistics Agency's electronic catalog. Humacyte said that Channel made the product available for ordering by approximately 35 military treatment facilities and approximately 160 Veterans Affairs hospitals. A catalog listing is not a sale. A facility still has to approve the product, train its surgeons, determine how much inventory to carry, and encounter a patient who fits the approved indication. But the federal purchasing door was open. Humacyte subsequently reported that one military treatment facility placed an initial order. The company later said that the same facility reordered Symvess. The public disclosure did not identify the facility, the number of vessels purchased, or the dollar value of either order. So the evidence remains limited. But a reorder carries more weight than a catalog listing. A first purchase may be an evaluation. A second suggests that the product survived its initial examination. The broader federal pathway has also expanded. In May 2026, Humacyte announced that Symvess had been added to a contract administered by the Department of Veterans Affairs Strategic Acquisition Center. The company said the arrangement was intended to streamline access across approximately 170 VA hospitals. That is a VA procurement development. It is not a DoD bulk order, but together, the Defense Logistics Agency catalog and the VA contract create purchasing channels covering a substantial portion of the federal medical system. Humacyte originally launched Symvess at a price of $29,500 per unit. By 2026, company investor materials described a current price point of $17,000. Humacyte's budget impact model argues that the upfront product cost may be offset by lower complication costs, particularly those associated with infections and amputations. That argument has clinical and economic logic, but it remains a budget impact model. It is not a completed randomized cost-effectiveness trial, and its conclusions depend on clinical results, published evidence, and modeling assumptions. For the military, however, the calculation may extend beyond the original hospital invoice. Saving a limb can mean fewer surgeries, less rehabilitation, lower long-term disability costs, and in some cases a greater possibility that a service member returns to duty. Congress has also placed funding behind further work in this area. The final fiscal year 2026 defense funding table included a $1 million program increase under Combat Support Medical for biologic vascular repair for warfighters. The language does not name Humacyte. It does not guarantee that the money will purchase Symvess. And Congress does not directly place hospital orders. It provides the funding. The military then determines how to evaluate, train for, procure, stock, and potentially deploy the technology. At the company's stated price of $17,000, $1 million could theoretically purchase approximately 58 complete vessels if every dollar were spent directly on product. The funding document does not say that will happen. The money could also support training, field evaluation, logistics, data collection, or other biologic vascular repair work. Federal purchasing prices could also differ from Humacyte's stated commercial price. So the program increase should not be placed on Humacyte's revenue table before the government places an actual order. Separate Senate Armed Services Committee language encouraged the military's Joint Trauma System to evaluate biologic vascular repair technologies and, if advisable, incorporate them into standard military trauma protocols. The language specifically addressed extremity arterial injuries requiring urgent revascularization when the patient's own vein is not feasible. Again, that is not proof that Symvess will become standard military inventory. Through July 30, 2026, the public record did not show a bulk military purchase, a nationwide stocking mandate, disclosed multi-facility order volumes, or a joint trauma system guideline naming Symvess as standard care. Humacyte has said it is pursuing discussions with additional DoD facilities. That is a company statement. The next meaningful evidence would be additional military facilities ordering the product, disclosed surgeon training, repeat purchases, larger unit volumes, or formal inclusion in military trauma protocols. And that tells us what this could mean for the commercial ramp, not an overnight rescue. $1 million of federal funding will not cure Humacyte's cash burn. Even several dozen vessels would remain small beside the company's operating expenses, but military adoption could matter for reasons beyond the first invoice. The Pentagon and VA can provide institutional validation, standardized training, centralized procurement channels, battlefield and trauma experience, and a model that civilian trauma systems may eventually follow. If Symvess moves from occasional facility orders to routine stocking across federal trauma centers, sales could become more predictable. But that transition has not yet been demonstrated. Military adoption is a meaningful commercial option. It is not yet a proven revenue ramp. One military treatment facility purchased Symvess and subsequently reordered it. Federal procurement pathways now include both the Defense Logistics Agency catalog and a Veterans Affairs contract. Congress provided a $1 million program increase for biologic vascular repair for warfighters, and congressional committee language has encouraged military evaluation and possible incorporation into trauma protocols. Those developments are real. They create a credible federal pathway. They do not yet establish a bulk order, a nationwide stocking program, or guaranteed Humacyte revenue. The next question is no longer whether military medicine knows the vessel exists. It is whether additional federal hospitals decide that one belongs in the refrigerator. Just one more thing. Sometimes the most important pulse is the one you hear after everyone else has already left the room.